Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Craft and Business of Books with me, Tetyana Denford.
And I'm Marissa.
So Marissa and I are basically covering the tools, the tricks, the stumbling blocks to the writing process, but also we're offering you guys the perspective from the industry side, which is super hard to find sometimes. And we're going to try and cover everything in between. We have so much to talk about. And remember that we are on every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So make sure to click to subscribe below, and also feel free to leave any comments and questions, and we'll try and cover them in the show or in other shows. So nonfiction, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about the mystical world of nonfiction books. Completely different from fiction. Most large publishers, of course, have divisions and imprints that do both, right? In order to cover as wide a part of the market as they can, and make as much money as they can in different spheres. So nonfiction editors are really required to be incredibly versatile. Often able to make themselves mini experts in a vast range of subjects in a very short period of time for a short period of time, which is really really interesting. So Tetyana, you write both fiction and nonfiction. So from a writer's perspective, how do you approach them differently?
I mean, great question. And it's not something I normally think about, but I think if I approach fiction, it's more of a kind of a movie that happens in my head, and it all comes together. And there's a very specific energy when it comes to fiction, which to me, the way I write, it feels really relaxing. I don't really plan ahead when it comes to fiction. So there's no stress necessarily. There's a very different focus. But when it comes to nonfiction, there is much more of a plan in my head. I look ahead 10 steps and then craft something. The energy is so focused. I don't really know how to, I'd say, like, with fiction, it feels more relaxing, like I've said before. With nonfiction, I can see what works in advance. So I tend to write more notes. I tend to write more kind of themes. I write notes to myself more. Fiction just feels wild and free, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm running around in the garden screaming. But, the two are very different. The thread for me that holds the two together is that I tend to self-edit when I write, which tends to slow the process way down. But that doesn't change. I think with nonfiction editing for me is much easier because the voice is very raw and real, and it's my own. Whereas with fiction editing, I can tailor the voice to the content. I can tailor it to the theme and kind of what the book represents to me. So that is a little bit more involved. So I find both fun, but nonfiction has more of an effect, more of an impact, I think, on the reader and also for me, because it feels true to who I am, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I would approach it that way. I'm just curious, for somebody who's seeing it from a work perspective, how do you, I'd be curious to see, how do you edit nonfiction? How do you kind of approach it? How do you hear who that author is?
It presents a whole sort of different skill set really required from fiction. If you are going to bring a proposal to the table on the latest science on how the amygdala, or amygdala, I never know how to pronounce it.
I don't know either. Is it amygdala?
I think. You're gonna present something on how it affects your decisions at work. You are going to need to sound like enough of an expert on that topic to prove to your colleagues that it's worthwhile. And if the proposal has been brought to you, then you need to prove to an agent and an author that you are the right editor for their work. This may almost be more important here than in fiction, because you are often working with experts in their fields. They're gonna know when you're bluffing. I think it's interesting. I mean, nonfiction, of course, you have situations where you are dealing with very, very smart people. There is one book I recall working on specifically with the guest we will have on in a little while, where I walked out of the meeting with her author thinking, I've not had many moments like this in my entire life where I was just like, I'm not smart enough to work on this. I'm not smart enough to work on this. I didn't understand. And I was actually like going and doing lots of personal research just so I could really help, because it was just something so foreign to me, and it was not in my area of expertise at all. And I always have looked at our guest today with admiration, that she is able to so quickly do that, and she's very clever, and it shows. So I think that's, it's a really interesting position to be in as a nonfiction editor, to have the kind of mind that you can switch gears like that, and you can, in one day be working on a humor book, about our current political leaders, to then, something about, the tree of life. It's really fascinating. Nonfiction editors tend to be really fascinating people, I think.
I just wonder if you make that decision ahead of time. If you decide to be a nonfiction editor, how do you decide? Do you work on a specific kind of theme the whole time, or do you jump from one to the other? Do you think, okay, well, my specialty will be, how to take care of cats? I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's it. But do you focus on one particular subject, or do you say, right, do you have like a body of work behind you or experience where you say, I can actually jump from that to working on, historical nonfiction, or how many, gardening books are there out there, or how many, lifestyle books, or, and all of that is so popular right now. So I can't imagine jumping from one to the next would be easy.
No, I mean, you have, certain imprints within publishers that have specialty areas, but typically the nonfiction imprint or imprints, will still publish in pretty much any area. I mean, again, there are exceptions to that, of course, and everyone has their specialty that they're kind of known for, agents and within the industry, because you will have, of course, editors who tend to publish in a certain space, or, with a certain type of person or expert, or, or subject matter. And those themes do tend to emerge naturally, I think, based on the editor, based on their personal interests and personal preferences. But it's almost always quite varied, and actually will run the gamut, and it will be truly, like how to take care of cats, and then,
why did I come up with that? I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, often you will have one person doing both of those things.
That's amazing. I mean, that makes for a very full day. Yeah. So we have so many other questions to ask Holly. But before we bring her on, let's do what makes this book great. Okay, we're going to bring on.
So the first edition of Anne Frank's diary was published by Contact Publishing in Amsterdam in 1947, after the publisher contacted Anne's father to request that he submit a draft to them. So it had an initial print run of 3,000 copies, actually, which surprised me. It was not published in the UK and the US until 1952, and was famously rescued from the slush pile in the US by Judith Jones, who we, or at least I do, I know personally associate with someone else, another little known author called Julia Child. So the introduction for the U.S. Edition was written by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The book has, since it was published, sold more than 35 million copies and has been translated into 70 languages. So this varies a bit based on sources, those two numbers, but it's roughly agreed to be the same. So, Tetyana, what makes this book great?
I mean, from my perspective, I personally have always been fascinated by a book that collects stories. So we've kind of talked about that in previous episodes when we were talking about Chicken Soup for the Soul, and we were saying that, to me, there's something really fascinating and never ending about people's fascinations with stories. So when we look at things like, Humans of New York, and, when we share stories like that, I think it makes a huge impact. And to me, this book is, the fascination for me and how moving it is will never end. But it's a little bit disheartening to know that it wasn't seen that way in the beginning for so long. I think, they wanted to change it to make it a different story, where I think when something is so raw and honest and deals with uncomfortable subject and there's pain and suffering, I think as much as people want to turn away from that, I think it teaches us something, and it always will. That's something that will never change, especially nowadays. I think, people are learning so much when they listen to other people's stories, when they take the time to read and educate themselves. And I think this is a wonderful, shining example of something that people will always dip back into,
Absolutely. It's interesting, that you point out that that there was a reluctance to publish it, and that's absolutely true, because it was, when you look at when it was published, not that long after the war had ended, and people were still mostly convinced that no one wanted to be reminded of the war and read anything about it at that point. So, and there are also some, particularly, it's funny, I'm sort of reporting what other people say, but not that I believe this myself, but, particularly private passages, they're viewed as of a sort of sexual nature, as much as they can be for a 13-year-old girl who, and typical of any girl of that age, that were omitted from the original publication, because, people thought it was too much. And, these, now that, of course, additional editions of the book have been published that bring in more of the original text, passages that still on occasion, end up, there end up being discussions about in American schools, and, because something's an issue, and, they'll ban the book for. I think that what's so interesting about this is that she wanted it all to be published. She had literary aspirations. She actually rewrote parts of the diary after hearing the Dutch Minister for Education, Art, and Science on the radio in 1944. It was saying that they didn't just want sort of journalistic reporting on what was happening, but they were looking for ordinary documents, right? So diaries and letters, for example. So she was, she knew she had done that. I think that's so interesting that she was editing herself in 1944, because she then went and rewrote parts, for this, and the ambition and the presumptuousness, right, of this young girl is delightful. I think it's a joy to kind of think about it in that way. And, in accordance with her peers' opinions of her, really, she was a bit presumptuous, in a bit right?
I call it feisty. Yes.
But it's, of course, also, extraordinarily heartbreaking, because we know what was about to happen. Yeah. So, looking at this through the lens of the publishing industry, it's an example of one book, right, which emerges as an icon of a moment, right? And that does happen, of course, occasionally. This is the book that is most closely associated with the Holocaust. And, most sources agree that Anne's Diary is the most read work, right, of and about the period. Yeah. As it's required reading in most American schools, and has been since not long after it came out, actually. So that's, it really, if you are someone who has been through the American school system, you've read this book. Yeah. So that's, of course, again, if you're talking about publishing success, yes, we can get on school reading lists. Yeah, you're going to be, but it's, it has been said by the Anne Frank Center that, for many people, this is their first, if not their only, exposure to the history of the Holocaust. Yeah. So, that's a really hefty carry as a book, right? That it is for a lot of people, this is their knowledge, that's outside of a history book, outside of a classroom. This is their only the only thing that they've read that really talks about what happened. And it is kind of interesting because it is a very specific view of what was happening, and it does not. Yes, it does not take into consideration, of course, anything that happened to her after she was taken, from Amsterdam.
Yeah, and it's an impact. It's a moment. It's one person that can make a difference. And I think finally, when people really kind of took a chance on this book and wanted to show everybody the layers of what a human being can go through, I think probably working on that book from the editing perspective, from publishing, from whoever brought it to life, I think must have been a really special experience, if not terribly heartbreaking and moving. But that's the impact that one story can have. And I think anybody who tries to do that, who writes a book that's a collection of stories and can actually get through and put it on a shelf, I think that it's a never-ending process for human beings to learn about each other. And I think that will just never stop being magical,
Of course, her voice is what's is iconic about this, that remains true. It's the defining work of the time. And if you can find the definitive voice on a subject, right? And that's not necessarily the most knowledgeable person.
Yeah.
But the person who can truly capture the spirit of a subject.
Yeah.
Right. And that's when you have your great book, which I think leads us to.
We'd love to hear it. If you guys found what you think about Anne Frank's diary, please leave a comment below. And we're going to now bring on our guest, Holly Harley. Welcome, welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you both.
So I'm going to introduce you. Our guest today is the delightful Holly Harley, who is currently a commissioning editor at Little Brown in the UK, where she acquires and edits nonfiction for the Piatkus and Bridge Street press lists, which cover between them topics such as health, pop psychology, well-being, upmarket science, memoir, history, and other smarty pants books. So she has worked in publishing for 8 years. She's been in her current role at Little Brown for a year. She came from Weidenfeld and Nicholson, right? Before that, where she edited literary nonfiction and worked on multiple Sunday Times bestsellers. And she is an expert. I had to say that.
She's sitting
With it. No. Go. No, you finish your spiel before.
That is, I know you love cats, and those.
But I suppose the first point I can make, and to kind of circle back on what you guys were talking about before about how you as a non-fiction editor become an expert in something over a short period of time. You don't, and there are a lot of things that you still just don't know. But it's about kind of I'm sure we'll get onto it. But you flatter me, Marissa.
I asked you to be on for a reason.
So I'm going to kind of, again, as I always do, I'm going to approach it from a creative aspect. So when somebody submits a nonfiction proposal and you've worked on loads, tell me what you like to see in them. What moves you? What makes you go, yes, I hear this voice really clearly. Or because obviously there's not a one size fits all. You're getting kind of from different directions. Mm-hmm. So tell us kind of what happens when you see it and then you kind of get your hands on it.
So my job, part of the two strands of the two imprints that I work for, means that I'm kind of looking for very different things in the first instance. So for one list, the Bridge Street Press is quite literary and it's quite upmarket. And in that case, that is where you're looking for things like voice. And then on the other side of things on Piatkus, it's much more practical nonfiction. But in both those cases, the things that really make a proposal kind of stand out and that make sort of me really sit up and pay attention is when it's something it's the least sexy point to make, but when there's a kind of a clear business case, when it's something that, if you've already had an idea or there's something at the back of your brain that you're thinking, I need a book on this subject. I have a space on my list that means that I'm looking for a particular book by an expert on that sort of area. That's something that I always look for. Another thing that I really am always on the lookout for is when something is just very finely crafted, when you get somebody who is really in control of their subject matter. And maybe because with nonfiction as well, you are dealing with a whole cast of different sorts of people. So you might have somebody who is a journalist who has a gift for or a natural talent for writing anyway, but in other cases it might be somebody who's an academic, and they may not have the greatest flair for writing in the first instance. But one of the things that unites all of those authors, and there's something that is kind of the golden thing that I always do look for, is when an expert or somebody who has been through a unique experience can communicate their enthusiasm or their passion, and they can share it with you, and they can kind of bring you on board. And to kind of circle back on when we're sort of talking about you become an expert on something, the best thing about the best nonfiction is that you're being brought in by the author into this new world, into new knowledge, and you kind of become an expert by proxy because you enjoy what you're working on so much, or you're informed, or you can see that there's an importance to something that needs to get out there into the world. Although at the same time, I would say that definitely, for me at least, a turn off is always when a book is just important, and that it's maybe it's kind of crude for me to say, but like that's not always enough, because there are so many important things that need to be discussed out there, that it needs the extra bit of the platform, or just that kind of that extra spark.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, you look for a specific kind of energy. If an author who's writing nonfiction doesn't believe in what they're writing, you can tell, right? You can see through it. You need somebody to embody that energy, to be like, okay, here's, even if you say no, I'm guessing like you'll still kind of see that infectious kind of, energy. And then maybe that's something that you could always say, would you ever say to somebody, okay, maybe not this one, but I kind of like where you're coming from, maybe something like at another point,
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And you can tell when somebody's dialing it in a bit. And one of the things that you can always do is, if it's something that's a killer subject, or if it's something that, this is the only person who's going to be able to write this book on this particular subject, you can of course work with them. And that is a big part of the job as an editor, is that you kind of finesse what they're trying to say, and you kind of are the backstage manager moving those things around. But certainly I think, without sort of sounding too woo-woo about it, there is definitely, I think, a talent in writers that exists across the stream, across fiction and non-fiction, that when somebody is really committed to being an author, because it's a career, right? It's a job. You don't just write a book and then you sit there and it's done. There needs to be somebody who's going to be able to actually kind of represent what that book stands for, whether that's science or memoir or politics, or something that's more instructional, if it's psychology, if it's, they need to really be that across the board. And that's where that enthusiasm really can help with that, because you can see how, if they've managed to bring you into their fold, that's how they're going to, that's how you can also bring in readers.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So Holly, you are known, I think, for coming up with original ideas and making them come to life, right? I have seen some incredibly unique things come from you, end up being, very successful. So can you tell us about your process for sort of coming up with ideas when you go out to people instead of having them come to you, right? And how you go about executing less traditional publishing projects? What kinds of research do you do? What sources of information do you use to inform those concepts?
Well, so thank you. There's varying ideas of varying quality that have gone through various acquisitions and ideas meetings over the course of the years. But that's kind of one thing, is that maybe it's not so much widely known, but all big nonfiction, I say all nonfiction in principle, really overall, they have ideas meetings where editors will talk about things that they have seen all over the place. And that's literally not just the news or magazine articles or podcasts, or you might hear somebody interesting or see somebody interesting talking about a particular subject, or there may be interviewed as a talking head on a documentary, and you sort of think, maybe that could match up with something, maybe they could write a book about that. But the other things that you might do is, you might even see a kind of trending hashtag, and it might just sort of spark some kind of mad idea in your brain, and you can get something together quickly and go out with it, and capitalize on that kind of momentary attention. Yeah. So I suppose there are loads of different ways that you can go about kind of creating these new ideas. And one of them is obviously to approach people directly. So say if you see somebody on social media and I think that they've got, they're really interesting, or if there's somebody whose interview I see in an article and I contact them and just ask them, basically, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? And depending on where that topic goes, a lot of the time those conversations end up where you can't commit, because it's a massive commitment to make. But when that isn't the case and you can start building a project, you basically are working with the author directly to put together a proposal and to put together the kind of thing that you would send an agent, basically, because I will then have to share it with my colleagues. I'll then take it to a big acquisitions meeting. I'll present it to the team, and you have to make the business case for it, because I mean, if I could just go out and commission whatever nonfiction I liked, then my list would look very different to what it looks now. I love everything I work on, but there'd be a lot more, just other bits and pieces. So that's one way of kind of doing it, is that you basically, and obviously for a lot of people, an agent is an essential part of that process, because it's somebody who's your ally, it's somebody who can help you navigate your way around different publishers. But if it's somebody that you have been approached by who's an editor, and they're really enthusiastic and you really like them and you gel with them, like, you should always meet them as well before, so that you can know if you're going to work well together. Then you kind of go through that process and you almost skip that step. Another way of kind of going around with generating ideas is that you have the idea and you might have a journalist that you know, or a ghostwriter that you know, and you will approach them and basically give them the pitch and say, this is the idea that we have, could you put this together? And again, you, the editor, are kind of the cheerleader of that, and you're putting all of that project together from the ground up. So you, in those sort of cases, you are not only do you not really have the agent, but you also don't really have an author. It's just you kind of creating content, which is funny because it seems like such a strange thing in publishing, but actually, it happens all the time in things like TV, and it's just this sort of weird example of how this media form is kind of different to others. And then, of course, in the final example I was going to give is that you also sometimes have an idea. It's really great if it's something that's exceptionally quick and easy to do, and you don't have anything of a budget, you can write it yourself and put it together yourself. And I know there's junior editors who do this sort of thing. You can put together a human book, and it's a great way when you are a younger editor and you're not going to get, you're not always going to get submissions from the big agents because they might go to your boss, that you can cut your teeth on thinking of a concept, bringing it to market, adding in all of those extra parts of the publication plan that aren't necessarily just the book itself. You get to learn about how you do marketing, how you deal with publicity and things like that. So over time, I'm sure you've honed kind of your instincts when it comes to, seeing something really special when it comes to nonfiction. But have there ever been moments where you just go, oh God, this is not going to work? I'm going to have to kind of stop the process. Have you ever kind of spoken with an author and been like, I don't think I can do this? Or does that never happen? Do you just kind of trust, like, have you always been kind of correct in what you've been kind of, the projects that you've been working on? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it will happen at some point or another. I'm still at the sort of beginning, I suppose, over the course of my career. But I think because the process at the beginning of acquiring a book and putting together everything that you need for pitching it just to your colleagues is a really long and arduous process, and takes a lot of research. You have to look at other things on the market. Perhaps it says something about my personality, but I often I look at what I've got and I make up arguments to fight against. Why, if somebody will say, why do you want to publish this book? Why is it?
Oh, that's really interesting.
Because if you aren't 100% certain on what you want to buy, then how on earth are you going to sell it to the rest of your team and to actual people who are going into the bookshops?
You know what? If I can interrupt, I'm so glad that you said that, because again, we're working under so many assumptions. So many people, like, without having the information, go, oh, well, look, they just pick something and then it happens and then everything is perfect. I think I really like that you've just let me and everybody else into the fact that the beginning is so incredibly important when you go through so many processes in order to say, is this something that we want to work on? Mm-hmm. Because it's not just, I see something, I snap my fingers, we go to print, and then it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you want to get really, really deeply boring, the conversation, the conversation that we often have, and this particularly is true for Bridge Street Press, because we have conversations about where we will publish books and how many, and Bridge Street only publishes 5 titles a year. That's one of the features of the list. We just do 5 great books a year, and that is it. And once the portcullis comes down on that, that is all you can publish. So when you are thinking about what you want to publish and who you want to bring on, who you want to work with, you have to think about slots, as we sometimes refer to them as. You have to think about where that will fit in the schedule, how that will complement the rest of the books you're publishing. Because as much as I'd love to publish, 40 books a year, I am one human person and cannot do that.
Amazing. So it's like, I always use kind of slightly cheesy examples, but I'm just wondering if this is the Marie Kondo of just, really kind of streamlining your process and making it so kind of, black and white, so that there's never you're not adding more to your plate. You're never wasting energy on stuff that you'll eventually will not be working on anyway. It has to be really streamlined.
Yeah, I mean, saying that, I was looking earlier today at my I keep like a log of everything that I ever get submitted because, spreadsheets, and it makes
we love spreadsheets.
And it's like, well, at the same time, you obviously have to be highly selective, and you have to, take the things that you really know you're going to bat for. Yeah. I lose out on so many books. We all do, that's the nature of the beast. You have to take. And so a lot of the time you do a lot of work, you do a lot of crawling on your knees to the sales department to make sure you can try and get enough money to sort of offer to get, and you have these meetings with agents and their authors, and you have a big sort of, you're like, yes, we're going to get this, it's going to be amazing. And then you get an email or a call and they say, no, sorry, they've gone with somebody else. And
no.
That happens, but that happens more often in the same way that a lot of ideas, when you approach people, they don't happen. So you have to that's why you sort of have to make sure that the stuff that you take forward, you really are going to fight for, because you're not always going to get it. And you need to be able to sort of pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and go back out there again.
Yeah. Sure. One of the things that we keep coming back to, I think, is the idea that a lot of people, a lot of writers think that all of the cards are in the publisher's hands or the agent's hands. And, it's, I think, really good to hear from people on the publishing side the reality of how things go about actually getting into your hands, and actually, when in the moment that you do get to work on something, it's not that simple. No. There are a lot of things, there are a lot of conversations that happen. There are a lot of, there's a lot of dating, basically. A lot of things have to line up. All of the cogs have to sort of work together for it all to come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And and one of the things that makes me, I always feel, I still now, years and years and years down the line, I still get it when it's really hard to reject things sometimes as well, because you can't win them all, but you also can't go for them, absolutely all of them. But it's funny that listening back to some of the other episodes that have been on the show before, and people who've been on the show before, it's funny for a business that trumpets when we talk about success all the time, and there's these bestsellers and there's amazing things like that. There is a lot of rejection behind the scenes, no matter where you are or where you go.
Yeah, like the revelation of that, I think, is going to be fascinating for so many people, because ironically, the opposite happens when somebody hears the failures and just alongside the successes. It actually makes people feel better and more connected, because there's a humanity behind it. And I always use that word because, there is something that makes it more attainable suddenly, when they're like, okay, well, they struggle with kind of being let down, just like I would struggle with being let down. When we were talking to an agent previously, she was saying it's really hard when an author goes, I'm going to go with somebody else. No, not many people hear that side,
No, exactly. It's about resilience as well. Then I just like the books that I do. But it's important to know that, and to keep at it if that's the path that you want to do, whether you're a writer, whether you are, somebody like me in my position, you have to keep faith, because it will happen.
So let's ask you a fun question. off the back of that? So if you were not an editor, what would you be doing?
I would be, I know for sure exactly where I'd be. I'd be, I mean, not right now, because obviously the pandemic. I would be in some sort of desert in Mongolia. I'd probably be like a scientist or like a fossil hunter. I'm like obsessed with, I mean, Marissa will know this from when we used to work together, but one of the weird things that I ended up picking up in the course of my career so far is that I just love science, and I love sort of the way that pop science is communicated is amazing. And I think if I hadn't been an editor, I probably would have.
I wonder if that goes hand in hand though, because if you're fascinated with the minutia of something, editing is kind of forensic in its own way, even though it's kind of creative. So I think that those two marry each other quite well.
Yeah. I mean, but one has to be. I think it's the same way as if you're excavating a like prehistoric feather. You can't get too lost in the weeds. Like,
yeah,
so much of the commissioning job is communication, and it's not always just kind of working on the actual books themselves. That you have to. I mean, that's obviously what I would be doing if I was out there in Mongolia.
That's a good plan. Holly, whilst you're in the middle of the desert, my final question to you will be, what is your desert island book?
Probably I'll have to be a real basic about it, and it would be The Secret History by Donna Tartt.
That's a good one. Yes.
Yeah. I studied classics when I was at university, so obviously, and read it while I was at university, and I've thought like, what? Oh God! I mean, is this what I've signed up for? But luckily, no murder.
Yeah.
No murder. I think that's great ending.
It's a good one to dip into and out of. So yeah, that's a good choice.
Holly, thank you so much.
It's been so lovely having you, Holly. Honestly, like the amount of information you've just given us and everybody else who's watching is just so helpful, and it's really empowering. So it's been great having you on the show.
Awesome. Thank you, Tetyana. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you. Bye. Oh, well, that was so nice. Honestly, I think it's, the amount of work that goes into dissecting a manuscript, especially when it comes to nonfiction, because there's such a wealth of information that you have to dive into.
Yeah.
I think like I've said before, it's a full day. I mean, how do you get through more than one manuscript every week or so? I don't know how I would do that.
I don't know. We need other people to tell us.
Exactly. And hence the magic of the show. Oh, goodness. All right. Okay. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. It's been great having you here. Remember to click to subscribe. We are on every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's been really fun.
See you next week.
Every time I do this ending, I have to look for the video. Right. Thanks, guys. See you later.